speak with you all today. Um, I mean, it's always an honor to be asked to talk about one's work, and it's especially, um, and especially when, I'm sharing a project like this that has been so impactful for me, as a scholar. So, um, I'm excited also to learn more about how you guys are engaging with the project. And I know, Hyungji, that you mentioned in your email that you're teaching your particular lesson plan in the seminar. So I'm just curious to just hear how that's going and just to kind of get some insight into that. So my talk today has three parts. So I'll start with just talking about the project and its development. I'll give an overview of Undisciplining the Victorian Classroom, or UVC as we like to call it, and how it started. Then the second part, I'll talk about the impact of UVC, or what I see as the impact of UVC on Victorian studies. And in the third part, I'll talk about the future of UVC, or where I think it might be going. And just to kind of give you a heads up, the first part is the longest part, and the second two parts are, the second and third parts are a bit shorter. Okay, so part one, the project and its development. So UVC, again, also known as Undisciplining the Victorian Classroom, is a digital humanities project that was founded in 2020. More specifically, we are a peer-reviewed digital humanities project that reimagines how to teach Victorian studies through a positive race-conscious lens. The project anchors itself on the idea that teaching must be taken seriously as a critical practice, as a site of disciplinary formation and transformation, and as an integral part of anti-racist, anti-colonial, and decolonial organizing and activism. By developing and publishing pedagogical materials that introduce less studied global Victorian era writers, artists, and communities into the classroom, and that engage with scholarship from fields that Victorianists have historically viewed as separate from their work. So that would include things like Black studies, Indigenous studies, Latinx studies. UVC seeks to inspire new modes of teaching and to model alternative forms of scholarly production that challenge white privilege, Anglo-centric ways of knowing, and conventional lines of academic hierarchy. So here are the founding developers, and I'll just introduce them one by one. So first we have Ryan Fong, who is an associate professor, soon to be full professor. He just got promoted of English at Kalamazoo College, which is a small private liberal arts college in Michigan. Next, we have Pearl Chowson-Bauer. She's really the one who instigated all of this. And she is currently a high school English teacher at the Nueva School in California. But when we started all of this, she was an associate professor of English at Notre Dame de Namur University, which is a private Catholic university in the San Francisco Bay Area. But for a variety of reasons, she decided to leave academia, and so she's teaching secondary ed right now. Then there's me. Again, as Hyungji said, I am assistant professor of English at Lehman College. I also actually recently got tenure and got promoted, so I will soon be associate professor. And then we have Adrian Wisnicki, who is professor of English at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, which is a public R1, Research One land grant institution. So just a quick note on this photo. This was the first time that all the founding developers met each other in person. This is actually only one of two times that we were all together in the same place. And this was in October 2021. So this was over a year after we started the project. And so I just kind of like to note that just to kind of give you a sense of this project was developed fully online. We're all in different places in the US. But we found kind of the digital space as kind of really allowing us to collaborate together as fully as we have been. So These next set of photos, these are the project directors now. So Pearl stepped down as a project director in 2024. So, here are who are currently leading the project. So it's, of course, Ryan, me, Adrian, and then we've also added on Cherry Kwok, who is starting her new job, her first full-time faculty job as an assistant professor of English at the University of Iowa in the fall. Cherry started with us from the very beginning as a lesson plan author uh, in one of the kind of first clusters that we published on the site. So she started with us when she was in grad school. She, kind of continued to contribute to the project in various ways and kind of stepped on in a larger capacity as an associate editor, again, while she was still in graduate school, and is now kind of stepping into that director role, along with this kind of new faculty position that she has. So yeah, that's UVC and the UVC leadership team in a nutshell. And now I'm just going to give you a sense of how the project began, lace out some of our key objectives and practices, and provide an overview of our content. So you'll see here some of the kind of major events that propelled the project. So like I said, UVC began in 2020 at the height of the pandemic. And so, the racial, economic, and global inequities heightened by the pandemic were really top of mind for everyone. In addition to that, if you recall, there was a particular interest in pedagogy during that time, given the sudden shift to teaching remotely that educators everywhere were facing. This new context of pandemic learning, pandemic teaching, especially emphasized the need for care-centered and trauma-informed approaches to pedagogy. And again, educators were kind of both together and separately trying to grapple with this context, scrambling to figure out, what it means to teach in that moment, when death and illness were surrounding us. Another major impetus for the project was the murder of George Floyd by police officers in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And although Floyd was, one of many Black people who were killed at the hands of police in 2020, let alone before that year, Floyd's murder, because it was captured on tape and that recording was disseminated widely, instigated the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and other calls for racial justice in the US and worldwide. And so as a response, many academic organizations, including those dedicated to Victorian studies, developed programming focusing on examining race, racism, and the ongoing violence of imperialism. And the UVC founders were all, to various degrees, part of those conversations. But again, it was before we all knew each other, kind of as a leadership team. What really brought us together was the publication of the field-changing essay Undisciplining Victorian Studies, which was written by Ranjani Chatterjee, Alicia Christoph, and Amy Wong. This essay, which first appeared in the LA Review of Books, and then there was that accompanying special issue in the journal Victorian Studies that really shook our field out of its complacency by calling for a radical remaking of Victorian studies through a more careful and thorough examination of race. And this remaking, as these authors urged us, needed to happen in terms of not only the objects of study in our field, but also its methods, citational practices, hiring criteria, and social conventions. And so the undisciplining essay came out, the original essay came out on July 10th, 2020, and just 10 days later, we had our first discussions about a potential collaboration. And I remember distinctly receiving that email out of the blue from Pearl and Adrian. I had no idea who they were. And they were just simply asking for a meeting. But I knew I had to take it because, they had the same reaction to the other as I did, which was, to ask ourselves, how can we, as not just scholars, but also teachers of the 19th century, respond to this? And so that takes me to our key practices and objectives. So Pearl, Adrian, Ryan, and I, we had our first meeting on Zoom, and we kept meeting weekly online for about the first 6 months of our collaboration to brainstorm and develop our ideas. And from those early conversations, these practices and objectives emerged. So we decided early on that the main objective of our project would be to expand the ambit of the original Undisciplining Victorian Studies essay to pedagogy. So just for context, in case you're unfamiliar with that essay mostly focused its argument on the kind of research that Victorianists produce. And so we wanted to extend their idea of undisciplining specifically to the classroom. And there are several reasons for why we chose to focus on pedagogy. So for one reason, it's because teaching is the aspect of our jobs that we all do, right? No matter what level you're at, no matter what your institution is, teaching is what unites us as a field and as a profession. Another reason is because teaching is arguably when we see most immediately the impact of our work. Even though it's often viewed as secondary, at least according to the traditional practices of academia. And so our pedagogical decisions affect our students, right? What they're exposed to, how they see the world, how they relate their education to themselves. And so these decisions shape future research agendas, and so it lays the groundwork for new scholars entering the field. And so through teaching, by focusing on teaching, we were really able to see how we could potentially kind of touch all aspects of our profession. The next 3 bullet points here outline how our project expands and applies the idea of undisciplining with our content. So for us, undisciplining means, and I've kind of mentioned this already, it means teaching Victorian studies through a positive race-conscious lens. It means including less studied global Victorian era writers, and it means engaging scholarship from multiple fields. And all of this is in service of making Victorian studies relevant for students today, but it's also crucial, I think, for ensuring that the field remains vibrant for its own scholars. And finally, we recognized early on that centering race and creators of color in our classrooms must also involve making room for scholars of color and other underrepresented scholars to have their voices heard and to lead this transformation of the field. So the final guiding practice and objective that I have here is to involve and as needed to support permanent faculty, contingent staff, independent scholars, and students. And so underrepresented scholars are the ones who already have the embodied and practical expertise to do this work of thinking and talking about race in the white-centric fields, such as Victorian studies, but they might not have the platform to showcase their knowledge because of, structural inequities, hiring practices, et cetera. So we decided from the very beginning to be very intentional in who we were including and seeking out to contribute to our site. Okay, so just about 4 months after we started collaborating, we launched our prototype website. And this was very bare bones. I think it was just our mission statements, and we had a call kind of seeking volunteers to help create content. And during the next 6 months, we developed content in teams. And so each of the founders were in charge of, one team, one set of materials, and developing and publishing them. And so this is a very collaborative time. We were emphasizing process and quality over speed and quantity. So we wanted to make sure that the initial materials we were putting out there would kind of represent the ethos of our site, of our project. And so in April 2021, the full website launched with those initial materials. And then September of that year, we received an invitation from the Journal of Victorian Studies to edit a special forum. And what was significant about their invitation was not only the fact that, this is the flagship journal of the field. So it served as some early evidence that we were, indeed making waves in our little corner of academia. But their invitation also noted that the journal hadn't focused on pedagogy before, but that this was an important time to do so. And so that seemed like a significant acknowledgement for the journal to make. Also, in September of that year, we were peer reviewed by Reviews of Digital Humanities. And so RDH is a peer reviewed journal as well as a project registry for digital humanities projects. And so we submitted UVC for peer review to them because the imprimatur of peer review means something in academia. Even as we were trying to trouble those kind of traditional practices. And so this review meant that our project would be in a way double peer reviewed. So the site as a whole is peer reviewed by RDH, but also then the kind of individual pieces that we're publishing, we send them out for peer review through our open peer review process. So I'll wrap up this first part of the talk by talking about the content of the site. I won't go into detail about everything that we've published so far. You can check out the site on your own for that. But I do want to explain some of our reasoning for why we publish what we do. So we publish pedagogic materials in these four genres. First, we have Zoomcasts, which are video interviews with teacher scholars conducted and recorded via Zoom, and that comes directly out of our pandemic era origins. Next, we have lesson plans. These are organized in clusters around specific themes, and they provide instructors with recommended texts, critical questions, and pedagogical approaches that they can take into their own classrooms. Our third genre here are the syllabi, and these are published with methodological essays that expound upon the critical framing of each syllabus. And we thought that was particularly important. We didn't want our site to kind of just be another syllabus repository. There's a lot of those online, and those are useful. But again, in our initial conversations, what really kind of rose to the surface was that it's not just about what to teach, but how to teach those things. And so we thought that publishing the syllabi alone wouldn't be enough for that. So some kind of essay that kind of walks you through the steps, explains the particular context of that instructor. We thought that would be particularly useful for especially when we're thinking about undisciplining, right? And rethinking the kind of usual methodologies that we might be using to approach these texts. And then finally, our last genre assignments, this is our newest genre. These are also published with accompanying essays, and these essays highlight the innovative ways that instructors are empowering students through critical and creative engagement. And so we chose these genres because, of course, UVC is focused on pedagogy. But we also chose these genres because this is the scholarly labor that academics are already publishing but aren't getting recognition for. At UVC, we want to recognize pedagogical work as scholarship. And so we want to provide a path to publication with fewer barriers, especially for those who don't have the time or resources. And so, if you're already producing these things, lesson plans, syllabi, assignments, why not publish them as well, right? Why not recognize them in a scholarly fashion? So as I've already noted, right, teaching is something that all academics do, regardless of your geographical location, regardless of if you're at a research-based institution or something like a community college or a regional university that has less funding, and we're all kind of experiencing less funding these days. hopefully these are things that you already have, right? These are seeds for publications that you can already use. And also in our view, those employed at teaching heavy institutions really have more to add to conversations about how our field should be engaging students, right? Again, given their heavier teaching loads and given their experiences with, most likely a larger and more diverse student body. Yet those are also the reasons, among many others, for why such teacher scholars are marginalized in Victorian studies. And so our focus on pedagogy then enables us to turn the tables and change what counts as, and more importantly, is respected as rigorous scholarship. By publishing genres that don't usually get recognized in the academy and by arranging for their peer review, um, we seek to bring the same kind of intellectual seriousness applied by established academic journals while simultaneously recognizing and celebrating the many places where knowledge is produced and the various forms through which it can be expressed. These genres of publication provide structurally vulnerable scholars the space and opportunity to release their work in a refereed format that affirms their intellectual standing and frames their contributions as on par with scholars who have the privileges, time, networks, and resources to publish traditional articles and books with mainstream journals and presses. Moreover, the genres showcase how the work of our authors within the classroom, which is perhaps the most foundational and central place of academia, offers some of the most innovative and interdisciplinary insights about how Victorian studies can approach its cultural objects with an increased awareness of and as a critical reflection on race and racism. So that is part one of my talk. I will now move on to part two and discuss a few ways in which we might be able to measure the impact of UVC on Victorian studies. And then I'll also talk about a bit about how UVC has impacted my own sense of the field and my professional development. So to date, UVC has published 10 Zoomcasts, 33 lesson plans, 21 syllabi, and 7 assignments. And so you'll see here, I haven't listed, every individual thing, but I've kind of listed them by category, by the clusters that we've organized this content in. Our content extends the Victorian period as far back as 1402. And this is a nod to Hyungji's lesson plan from the Trans-Imperial Networks and East Asia cluster, where she references briefly the oldest surviving East Asian produced world map, the Korean Cognito. Our content also extends the Victorian period as far forward as the 2020s. In the lesson plan cluster on undisciplining in and through contemporary texts, the contributors there paired texts from the 19th century and the late 20th or 21st century to trace the continuities, frictions, and ruptures between past and present. On top of this, our materials widen the Victorian period to decenter England as the locus of the field. One of our Zoomcasts, for example, focused on the creators of Anglophone Chile, which is another DH project, digital humanities project, that preserves the print culture of English-speaking settlers in 19th century Chile. And in the process of kind of geographically expanding the field, our project also expands the methodological purview of the field to include interdisciplinary connections that enrich our analysis of the global networks interlinking Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Thus, in addition to widening the 19th century beyond the borders of the UK and beyond the borders of just formal British Empire, our site, we hope, will help to destabilize the hegemony of Western theory and scholarship by building more bridges among scholars from across the world. And in terms of our contributors and peer reviewers, we've tried to do this, though the vast majority of our authors are still from the US or UK. And this is a big part because the founders, the project directors are US based and we're educated in the US. And so these are just simply our networks. But one note I'll make about our contributors is that while we recognize that we still have significant room for improvement in regards to involving more scholars from beyond the Anglo-American Academy, and also, more Black and Indigenous scholars, we do make an effort to seek out underrepresented scholars, scholars who are underrepresented both in terms of their personal identities and their institutional positions. And so if you take a look at our site and look through our various contributors, look at their various backgrounds, you'll see that they teach at a variety of institutions. So from secondary schools to private institutions, from regional public universities to community colleges. And so here you'll see a glimpse of our user numbers. Just as a caveat, I don't have the latest figures. I wasn't able to, Adrian is in charge of our website, so I wasn't able to get them from Adrian in time for this talk. So these are figures that are based on data from about a year ago when I was putting my tenure packet together, actually. Um, so you'll see based on these figures that at least um, in the month of March 2024, UVC receives about 4,350 unique visitors every month and an average of 227 per day. And I remember when I talked to Adrian about these numbers, just trying to figure out if this is usual for us. I mean, he said it basically is. Some months it's a little bit more, some months a little bit less, but more or less, it kind of you see waves in terms of the academic year, but these are more or less the number of users that we get. So like our contributors, our users come from all over the world, though again, most are again from the US or UK. And we don't have a detailed breakdown of the demographics of our users. We'd need actual money and a much larger team to really kind of figure out all of that information. But I think you get a sense from these numbers, the reach of UVC, especially if you compare this to how many people are reading academic articles and monographs these days. The number of academics are just simply dwindling, right? And so to us, these seem like pretty good numbers in terms of the number of eyes we're getting on our site. So that data tells one version of the story of UVC's impact. I think another version could be told through the inroads that we've made in more traditional academic venues. So far, we've published 2 essays. One is in Victorian studies, and that is the introduction to our special forum that we also co-edited. And the other is in a special issue of Victorian Literature and Culture on Victorian and Victorianist activism. We've also given a few conference presentations, and we've been invited to speak both as a group and individually at various kind of academic institutions, organizations. And so I offer all of this not to toot our own horn, but to give you, again, a sense of our reach and how we've impacted the field. While before UVC, I'd say you would occasionally see an essay about teaching or at least mentions teaching in one of the major journals of the field, and maybe every once in a while there would be a panel on teaching at a conference. In the last few years, I've been seeing more and more of those. And whether that's a direct result of UVC or it's just a correlation, right? This is just kind of where academia is going. It's hard to say. I do think, though, that there has been a shift in the culture of the field prompted by the original Undisciplining essay. And the ethos of that essay is something that we've tried to maintain and fulfill, right? Specifically in terms of building a different kind of Victorian studies through our communities, our methods, and cross-disciplinary relations. And so that to me is really where the impact of UVC is felt, or at least where I'd like to think it's felt, where I'd like to think that we've made a difference. Though the content that we create is, of course, important for ensuring Victorian studies centers questions of race, and we've come to view this content as the organic outgrowth of the careful and caring relationships that we've been cultivating since our inception. In other words, what's emerged from our collaboration is the realization that our aims are not simply about changing what's taught in the Victorian Studies classroom about race, but also how those in our field relate to one another in undertaking this anti-racist and anti-colonial work. And so the last thing I'll mention in this section is how this ethos of care and community building with UVC has impacted my own academic arc. So I started collaborating on UVC during the summer after my second year on the job at Lehman. I was very new as a faculty member, just trying to get a hold on my teaching, let alone my research and everything else. And so I wasn't really sure what it meant to be an academic yet. I remember being quite intimidated by Pearl, Adrian, and Ryan. They were all tenured by then and had much more experience than me, knew many more people than I did. But they treated me as an equal. And hierarchies are always there, whether you reinforce them or not. But as much as possible, to me, those hierarchies felt like they fell away during our meetings. They modeled for me how to be a generous and collaborative colleague and peer mentor. And they gave me permission, whether I knew it or not, to dream and create and lead. You know, I remember taking that early meeting and having no idea what I was getting myself into. Um, and we exchanged all these ideas, brainstormed all these kinds of things. And I remember one day it just clicked that like, oh, we can just make this, we can just do this. There's no reason to not do this, right? It doesn't necessarily have to fall um, within an existing organization, within an existing institution, right? The four of us can just simply do this online and see who else will join us. And so that's something that's really stuck with me and influenced how I try to operate as a faculty member at my college, and as a colleague and mentor for those coming up after me. I want to find my people who are also willing to build together and to experiment and create better communities despite the institutions and structures that we're in. So in part 3, I will wrap up this presentation by talking a bit about where I think UBC may be going in the future. So I've mostly discussed the first phase of UBC, which was when we were building the project, right? Establishing the key practices and objectives, just creating that baseline content. In the second phase of the project, we realized that we needed more people, frankly, to help us out. So we hired associate and assistant editors to help us develop and publish more content. And when I say hire, I mean that loosely. We've never been a project that's been funded, so we couldn't give any kind of monetary compensation to our assistant and associate editors for their labor. And so we had to figure out other ways of compensation, mainly in terms of mentoring, helping them kind of develop skills that they felt like they needed in their career paths. Um, in this post-pandemic stage, again, we realized it couldn't just be the four of us running things anymore. In that first phase, everyone was remote, kind of other responsibilities kind of fell away. So it felt like we had all this time to do this. And really kind of when people were going back into the classrooms and just our various institutions were just kind of ramping up again, it just wasn't possible to dedicate so much time to this particular project on our own. Right now, I'd say that we're in a transition period and moving into the third phase of the project. And this is especially because, with Pearl stepping down and Cherry coming in as a director, we're needing to rethink the kind of leadership team. Ryan will also be stepping down from his director role later in the summer. And so the three of us who are left, me, Adrian, and Cherry, we're going to have to rethink how we're working together and kind of what is this new phase that we're in. We'd also like to find more assistant editors to help us out. Some of the previous editors that we've had have left for various reasons due to life and career. And so we want to continue building that pipeline from contributor to editor to director, right? The kind of pipeline that Cherry herself took. And that's something that's important for us. Again, something that we imagined from the very beginning. We didn't want to shackle the four founders to this project forever. Um, Always in our heads was there would be some kind of um, new leadership coming in at some point, right? New cycles of this project. This wasn't just a project we wanted to carry in terms of a burden of a digital humanities project forever, but also in terms of the four of us only have so many ideas, right? This idea of undisciplining the field, remaking the field isn't something that we felt like we could answer on our own. And so that was always kind of part of our vision with the project, that at some point, the four of us would step down to varying degrees and other people would step in and kind of take this to wherever they wanted to. And so immediately ahead of us, we do have more content in the works, but we'll also be facilitating a workshop slash conversation at the upcoming NAVSA in DC to help with growing the team, but also specifically just to see where the field is now with the question of undisciplining. And for us, undisciplining is as urgent as ever, perhaps even more so, especially in the US where we are, given the attacks on higher education, the dismantling of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, the increase in anti-immigrant discourse, and the intensification of racist right-wing governments and imperial powers. Yet again, these are also reasons for why undisciplining might be more vulnerable today, as these crises encroach on academics' abilities and capacities to speak and act as openly as they felt like they once could. And this kind of encroachment, I think, feels especially dangerous for those academics who we are seeking out, those who are marginalized due to their race, sexuality, gender identities and expressions, their religion, their citizenship status. And so some questions that we're grappling with and that we hope to ask during this event and that, we'll continue to be asking ourselves are these. So one, what are the stakes of undisciplining today in our classrooms and in higher education as global events encroach upon our pedagogy? Two, how must the methodology of undisciplining deepen or change under the new challenges that we're facing? Three, what do our students need from us in order to meet the urgent crises that are shaping their present and their futures? And four, what in turn do we as instructors need from our students and our fellow colleagues? The UBC project directors don't have any answers, just more questions. But what we know that we will do is to continue to imagine and collaborate together and with all of you. Much of what UVC will do will emerge in the organic processes of collaboration, of moving through challenges with courage and generosity, and of holding ourselves accountable to the highest possible standards. This will be driven not by us, the directors, but by a much larger collective with whom and from whom we will have the privilege to work and learn. Okay, so thank you. That's the talk that I have prepared.